Hi, I'm Steve Clements, and I have a question. As Israel's war on Gaza approaches its fourth month, with full U.S. support, who's going to be held accountable for the tens of thousands of innocent people killed? Let's get to the bottom line. In the name of destroying Hamas or any other resistance, Israel has killed more than 25,000 Palestinians in Gaza, overwhelmingly children and women, and it's maimed more than 60,000. The stories of amputations without anesthesia are countless, and they're just heart-halting. This war has triggered one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, where Palestinians now risk dying of hunger and disease, even though thousands of trucks filled with food and medicine are waiting literally a few miles away. Both Israel and the Biden White House still reject a ceasefire, though most of the world is demanding one. And on the political level, Israel still rejects any notion of a free and autonomous Palestine. And the U.S., while flirting publicly with the concept of a state of Palestine, is just doing very little to move any of the pieces to make it happen. So what's the off-ramp? Or has Gaza just become a quagmire for all involved? Today we're talking with investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill, editor-at-large and co-founder of The Intercept, and author of Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield. Jeremy, I've been struggling with the issue of American complicity. And I just want to start out saying, how can we be simultaneously, we meaning America, sending 2,000-pound bombs and that wringing our hands about the humanitarian crisis? How do you see White House strategy and direction in this conflict?
I mean, I think, Steve, that the blunt reality is that there's a core amorality to the Biden administration policy. On the one hand, you've had this full-throttled support, not just militarily and rushing through emergency tank munitions and other weapons to Israel. And by the way, not once but twice, Antony Blinken went around basic congressional review processes to send more tank munitions to the Israeli military, while simultaneously expressing concern about the fate of Palestinian civilians. And often Secretary of State Blinken, and in fact the president himself, they speak as though they are sort of spectators watching a football game, and they're cheering for their team or saying, oh, don't do that, when in reality, this whole thing could end quite swiftly if President Biden actually wanted it to. So I think what we're seeing is the White House spinning major media outlets and journalists to print these stories about how deeply concerned they are. How the new line is that Biden is losing patience with Bibi. But the reality is that Joe Biden's been in political office for a half century, and you can go back all the way to the 1970s and see that Joe Biden stands out in a field of pro-Israel politicians from both parties as one of the premier defenders of Israel when it's operating at its most gratuitous and engaged in what I think just bluntly should be called mass killing operations. This is not an aberration. This has been a hallmark of Biden's foreign policy career, full-throttled support for Israel when it's at its most obscene, I would say.
So what do you think the strategy is here? Are you arguing that the United States wants to clear and level Gaza, or is it something else? Is it just the fact that even someone like Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel is someone that has been reported to be at odds with Joe Biden, is known to prefer Donald Trump? Like, what is the incentive for this White House to acquiesce to what Netanyahu is doing?
Well, I think that actions speak much louder than words, and President Biden's actions are quite damning. I mean, Biden, for instance, Steve, has for decades carved out the issue of illegal expansion of Israeli settlements and has sort of used that as a pressure point to say, look, I'm not all in with Benjamin Netanyahu. Yes, he's my great friend. He's my good friend, but I disagree with him passionately on this issue. When it's come to Gaza, though, President Biden has been very aggressive in his support for Israel throughout the decades of military campaigns and supporting the merciless blockade that was imposed on Gaza. And I think that, you know, it's a mistake to try to just take politicians at their word. I think the dark conclusion we have to draw is that much of this Gaza campaign has proceeded in a way that President Biden must support. Because at every turn, when the United States could have used its unprecedented leverage in the world to try to stop it, It has instead sent more weapons, prevented a ceasefire from being voted to go through at the United Nations, has been defending Israel against genocide allegations at the International Court of Justice. So, I think it's a mistake to say, let's let politicians' words speak for them. The actions are what matter. And, on a policy level, the actions indicate that it's proceeding exactly how the White House wants it to. More than 25,000 Palestinians dead, more than 63,000 wounded. You have women having cesarean sections with no anesthesia. Children are having limbs amputated with no anesthesia. You have a hepatitis A outbreak. You have Gazans with 1 in 480 of them access to a toilet, one toilet for every 480 people right now. I mean, this is an abomination, and I'm sorry, Anthony Blinken is not at a think tank anymore. The Secretary of State doesn't get to go to Davos and say to Tom Friedman, "Oh, what is to be done?" Because what has been done is that the United States has offered political, legal, diplomatic, and military support for a scorched earth campaign that has killed an unprecedented number of civilians in a very short amount of time, Steve.
I'd like to play a sound clip of you of the Secretary of State Anthony Blinken here and get your thoughts.
None of the suffering would have happened if Hamas did what it did on October 7th, and had it made different decisions thereafter.
None of the suffering that we're seeing would have happened if Hamas hadn't taken its acts on October 7th. What are your thoughts, Jeremy?
Well, Hamas and the Palestinians could make a very similar argument to Anthony Blinken that would also, lack moral clarity, which is October 7th wouldn't have happened if Israel hadn't for 75 straight years been waging a war of annihilation against Palestinians, usurping Palestinian land, imposing an apartheid state in the West Bank, gunning down Palestinians when they did what Western leaders say they should be doing, which is to demonstrate nonviolently. In 2018, 2019, during the Great March of Return, when Palestinians organized nonviolent demonstrations at the fence of the prison that they live in with Israel, Israeli soldiers engaged, and this is not my conjecture, this is a Haaretz investigative piece citing soldiers by name, boasting of how they had a competition of who could shoot the most kneecaps of the protesters of Palestinians. So, to make an argument that pretends that October 7th was the beginning of the story of Israel and Palestine, or even a war with Gaza, is really intellectually dishonest. But also, Steve, that line that Blinken has deployed many times, that John Kirby has said, that President Biden has said, that the Israelis say regularly, that all this could end if Hamas would just lay down its weapons, release the hostages, and surrender, is akin to a kind of sadistic torturer who's saying to their victim, this will all just end if you only tell us who the real terrorists are. That this is sick to use the women and children, the civilians of Gaza, as sort of a pile of corpse that you're going to justify by saying, well, Hamas needs to release the hostages and lay down their weapons. There's 75 years of history here that could be pointed to that doesn't look good for Israel on a moral or political level. So I reject that. I think it's intellectually dishonest, and I think it's morally vapid.
I feel it's Vietnam. I feel if I were having watched television and seen the horrors of Vietnam, I feel in this. Do you feel that Americans are hearing or feeling this in any way at all, or Europeans or other observers are seeing this as another Vietnam?
Well, I think that on a purely analytical, historical level, I think it's an apt comparison. And, when occupying powers try to fight against a guerrilla force, and that's ultimately what Hamas is, and it's using tactics that are very similar to those used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, you can very quickly get yourself mired in a quagmire. And, back in November, I started talking about how it already seemed like on a tactical military level that Israeli forces were already finding themselves in a quagmire. If you follow Hamas's communications, and by the way, I think there's a totally cartoonish portrayal of Hamas that exists in much of the Western discourse, and I think it's a journalistic error. I think we have an obligation to understand who it is that we're being told are the new ISIS or the new neo-Nazis. But when you look at Hamas's communications, they are every single day releasing multiple videos of their attacks against Israeli soldiers. And in fact, there was a very deadly incident in mid-January. It was the single highest casualty incident that we know about of Israeli forces, when IDF soldiers, an engineering corps, was attempting to rig two structures in eastern Gaza outside of the Maghazi refugee camp with explosives, with mines. And there was some sort of an attack that took place from Hamas, and Hamas later released a video of it where they launched an RPG that appears to have set off a chain reaction that actually exploded the mines that these Israeli soldiers were trying to place in these buildings and brought the buildings down upon the soldiers, killing 21 of them. And I think that that was in some ways a metaphor for where the war stands right now. It's sort of collapsing on the heads of the Israeli soldiers that have been sent there on this war of annihilation that Netanyahu is boasting he's not going to quit until the end. The fact of the matter is that this is becoming a war of attrition. Hamas does not seem to be taking the kinds of casualties that Israel boasted of early on. These tunnel networks, Israel has only been able to penetrate a very small fraction of them. And at every turn, you see Netanyahu doubling down, even as the families of the hostages, the families of those killed on October 7th, ordinary Israelis are increasingly questioning whether or not Netanyahu even knows what he's doing or whether it's worth the cost to Israel to continue in this manner. So I think that there are some grave strategic mistakes that have already been made by Netanyahu in this. And the fact that the Biden administration is not at this point just sort of saying this has to stop. Let's remember, Steve, when people say, oh, what can Biden do? In 2021, the last time that Netanyahu engaged in this kind of in a sort of heavy bombardment attack against Gaza, and it was far lower in intensity than what we've seen over the past 100+ days, Joe Biden got to a point where he wanted it to end. He called Bibi. He basically said, it's burned enough. You're going to talk to the Egyptians. And within a couple of days, the thing was done. It was being wrapped up. So let's not pretend that Joe Biden doesn't have the power. And the fact of the matter is, you can read the Israeli press, which in some ways is far more open about what's going on in Gaza than the American or British press, to be honest. And you can see that some of the top defense correspondents for Israeli publications are saying what I just said, that there is real danger that this is becoming a quagmire, and that even within the ranks of the Israeli security forces, there are serious questions about whether this is a viable strategy to continue this way. But also, and I think crucially, there's an acknowledgement among the defense elite in Israel that if Biden was to threaten a cutoff of military support, particularly weapons, this thing would have to be wrapped up very, very quickly.
You know, Hamas is demanding a ceasefire and a full withdrawal of Israeli troops as terms to release hostages and to move forward. Israel has fully rejected that. It's demanding that Hamas disarm, do this. You've got maximalist positions on both sides. And, you know, it reminds me of the Ukraine conflict with Russia, honestly. You kind of see maximalist positions on both sides. What do you see as the end state that could be achieved? And are there other responsible stakeholder powers that can change the game in any way? Or is the U.S. just so dominant in the region that it's going to acquiesce to this and, you know, let it just keep going and going?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, one question that is seldom asked with any degree of sincerity in the discourse on this is, why is there a Hamas? Oh, okay, part of the story is there's a Hamas because people like Benjamin Netanyahu, and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu, wanted there to be a Hamas, because Netanyahu's strategy was that if you have people perceived to be violent extremists who call for the destruction of Israel in power in Gaza, that's the best way to prevent a Palestinian state from being achieved. And the New York Times did a fantastic expose about this, documenting how Netanyahu himself helped to keep the spigot of money open from Qatar into. Well,
he kept the spigot of money open, and he helped create them, and he helped split Palestinian leadership. Right, that was the whole idea.
Right. So that's one part of the story of why there's a Hamas. But more, what I'm getting at is, why is there armed resistance in Gaza? If it's not Hamas, it's going to be someone else. There's armed resistance because the Palestinians have been sent a message over the course of decades that diplomacy isn't going to work, that they're not going to be taken seriously, that Israel is going to remain entrenched in its defiant position, that there really can't be a Palestinian state. We might give you some rump thing that we feel is okay, but we're not going to ever actually allow you to achieve full independent statehood. And as long as you have an apartheid state in the West Bank, as long as you have a siege being laid on the people of Gaza, as long as Israel is in control of the air, the sea, the land, what goes in and out of Gaza, you are going to have an armed resistance. And I don't think, if you study history, I don't think that there's any people in the world that would just submit to the kinds of demands that Israeli leaders have placed on the Palestinian people. So if you want to have viable peace, you have to treat the Palestinians as full human beings. You have to stop demonizing them and treating them, in the words of senior Israeli officials, as human animals. That's the only way, the only true way to peace. The Palestinian Authority is deeply unpopular. The idea that you could have Mahmoud Abbas or any of the PA ride into Gaza on an Israeli tank or an American tank, that ain't going to fly. And in fact, Hamas has become more popular as a result of this war. And it's not that Hamas's ideas are necessarily popular. It's that the armed resistance has become popular among Palestinians because, from their perspective, they're dying. They're being killed off. At least someone is trying to fight the Israelis, fight the occupiers, fight the invaders. So whether it's Hamas or another armed group, these kinds of campaigns are not going to stomp out the tenacious determination on the part of the Palestinian people to achieve their rights to an independent state and self-determination. That's just the raw fact, Steve.
You know, I brought on this show some people who are part of the American military establishment, and they've all said that destroying Hamas is impossible. It is a movement, not a set of individuals. They said at the same time, Israel, for this to stabilize, is going to have to find ways to make common purpose with people. None of that seems to be happening. And so when I hear about this, and there's been talks about a Marshall Plan-like activity or rebuilding, you know, and coming back, I'm just wondering, how in the world is any of this possible down the road if the level of, it's really a kind of, you know, deep hate and disdain doesn't have any off-ramp? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I mean, also one specific thing that's happening, and it's now starting to become to sort of play out in the open, is that Israel is engaged in a campaign that I think is very clearly in violation of international humanitarian law, where they're going along the sort of administrative border between Gaza and Israel right now, and they're doing controlled demolitions of buildings. That's what they were in the process of doing when those 21 IDF soldiers got killed when the landmines exploded and the buildings collapsed on them. And the stated objective, and the Israelis just admitted this for the first time, is not to destroy Hamas tunnels or infrastructure, but it's to remove any structures that could potentially pose a security risk to nearby kibbutzes. And, you know, this is quite different than saying, oh, we're going to blow up Hamas headquarters and tunnels. They're actually justifying what amounts to a land grab. They're calling it a buffer zone, but they're preemptively taking more of Gaza's territory. So when you have those actions taking place, when you're essentially now annexing even greater portions of Gaza and stating that there isn't going to be any population there anymore, and then you want to talk about, well, what do we do on the day after? I think the Biden administration is getting played right now by Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu understands and is hoping that Donald Trump is going to somehow pull it off and win the U.S. presidential election. Yes, Bibi and Biden are very sincerely good friends for 40 years. But I think that Netanyahu understands that Biden's going to have to start thinking about his own election prospects and how this is going to affect it. It's not just Arab Americans, Steve, that are deeply concerned about this and are indicating that they're not going to vote for Biden, that they're going to sit out. But I think the U.S. standing in the world is going to start to be called into question, because this business of bombing Yemen and going after Ansar Allah and sort of ratcheting up the low-intensity conflict that's going on in Iraq, while at the same time saying we seek no wider war. This is good. This is putting American allies in Europe in a very precarious position. And I think that, you know, Joe Biden could have been a one-term president. He could have been very popular. He could have said, I saved the world from Donald Trump. I'm going to focus on my domestic agenda. But instead, what we've seen is Biden now getting himself completely affiliated with a heinous war that has killed more than 25,000 civilians, is not going to be wrapped up in a neat bow in time for the 2024 election. And I think it's really hard to draw any conclusion other than Biden supports this with some minor caveats because he's allowing it to continue. There's a tinderbox here that's blowing, and it's blowing up right as the U.S. election is getting underway.
Jeremy, I've read you for years. I've been reading your recent powerful exposés and analysis of what's going on. You're not pulling your punches like others in American media and global media have done on this crisis. How are you doing? How's The Intercept doing playing this role?
You know, when you stake out this position, and we had done a big series on Joe Biden and his politics over 50 years, right when he was inaugurated, and I did the lead reporting on the Israel section of it. I knew as soon as Hamas led those raids on October 7th that this was going to be a paradigm-shattering moment. And The Intercept has staked out a position because we don't believe in objectivity as it's defined by corporate elite media outlets and politicians. We believe accuracy is the most important component of journalism. But sometimes, Steve, the truth is just true. And in this case, we have a historic moment where the United States, Germany, Britain are on the wrong side of history. And I think that it takes journalistic principles to stand up and say, you know what, we believe that our readers have the right to understand the cold, hard facts. And we get a lot of messages from people saying they're not going to donate to The Intercept anymore, that they aren't going to support The Intercept anymore. It's a very difficult fundraising environment, given what The Intercept has been reporting on over the past several months. We wouldn't change it for anything, Steve, because I think it matters. And I'm ashamed of our colleagues in American media for the silence over the killing of our journalistic colleagues from Al Jazeera, independent Palestinian journalists on the ground. This is, we all were shocked and horrified when Jamal Khashoggi was killed. I was outraged, angry. I think Evan Gershkovich should be freed from his prison in Russia. Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen working for Al Jazeera, was assassinated by Israel in the West Bank, and the Biden administration has stymied the investigation into her killing. Dozens upon dozens of our colleagues have been murdered along with their family members in Gaza. We cannot be silent. We must speak up in defense of our colleagues and stand in solidarity. The murder of journalists must stop. This must be called for from the highest levers of power in the United States and in elite media. Democracy dies in the darkness. Our colleagues are being killed in broad daylight. It's got to stop.
Wow, Jeremy, thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Powerful. Jeremy Scahill, co-founder and editor at The Intercept. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
So what's the bottom line? Blowback was a term used by the CIA and made popular by the book Blowback: Consequences of American Empire by Chalmers Johnson during the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Israeli leaders swear that nothing's going to stop them from flattening Gaza and destroying any possibility for life in the Gaza Strip for years to come. My guest argues that none of this could have happened without full U.S. support, which makes this country complicit in this ongoing horror. Generations of Palestinians are now going to have to try and pick up pieces of their lives, but it's not going to be their problem alone. This has now become one of the world's biggest problems. Responsibility for Gaza and the Palestinian issue at large now falls on the shoulders of the whole world, not just the Arab world. The anger and the nightmares that are going to seethe from a future Gaza will find legitimacy in this horrible time, just like the U.S. adventures in the Middle East at the beginning of this century. Intended or not, the consequences of this war in Gaza are going to sow the seeds of payback or blowback, and no one knows how or when the bills are going to come due. And that's the bottom line.